மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Chasing this queen away, and of course, if this pawn is not very advisable to accept it, because after even the simple f3, there's an idea of g4, and this open h file is very dangerous for black. Instead, we have to play this move queen h7. Now, this is maybe one of the reasons why this variation wasn't accepted for black before, because it just looks frankly ridiculous to put the queen in this corner. But the queen is actually quite safe. It's targeting this diagonal, and in many variations, the queen can just emerge back on e4. For example, one game continued at g4, pawn takes, bishop d4. Now queen e4 comes out, and the queen is nice and active here, targeting the pawn on g4. And in general, like again I said, not that many games have been played here, so it's hard to tell what moves white is going to be really playing in the future. One other move that has been popular for white is d5, trying to create commotion in the center before this queen gets back in the game. But after pawn d5, rook to d8, pawn on d5 is getting quite weak. Queen e4 is on the cards. White has tried to move bishop h6, but after the calm rook e8, all these pieces are active. And again, the queen is always threatening to go back to e4, so it's not really loose. The pawn on d5 is hanging. And again, white's results have not been encouraging at all. I don't think white has won a single game in this line so far. I will put more details about that in the PGN. But suffice to know for now that, first of all, be armed with the confidence that your position is completely fine here. And furthermore, just c5, the queen can come back to e4. So again, this is a very critical variation, this bishop e3 move. White is really trying to just go g4, g5, and checkmate. But with both b5 and a queenside pawn storm, and this new modern, as of right now, looks like a complete solution, really, and top-level chess to this variation. c4, queen f5, check, king a1, c5. Getting this queen active, hitting these open light squares. Both of these moves look very, very reasonable. And if you pick up this variation, and especially if you're going to be playing some higher-rated opponents, you can expect this variation coming on the board a lot, and you will be very, very armed to deal with it. So that deals with the most critical option of bishop e3. So we will now round up this chapter by looking at basically the other variations that we have to know here. We're going to work our way back from this position. We just had a look at the move king to b1. We're actually going to have a look at this move for the last time, namely the variation here where white plays after knight f6, queen e2, queen d5. We looked at the very critical move bishop to e3, which blocks the queen exchange. But another very popular option for white here that actually used to be popular, now it's almost never played because bishop e3 has been sort of just the in move and just a strong move. The variation that I used to face before a lot was knight e5, where white tries to put this knight in the center, and then his goal is just to checkmate us and push these pawns up the board. But this variation has been pretty well neutralized by the move queen e4, just trying to get these queens off. And we're going to be actually talking quite a bit about these endgames here. In general, I should say now that these endgames are pretty harmless for black. And in my experience, the only issue that I've had here was generating winning chances and having to beat masters basically in this position, and having to sort of generate enough winning chances here. Now, white is advised to capture on e4 here. That's what he does in most games. I've faced bishop e3 here, which has the idea of potentially going f3 and then g4. But the queen on e4 is actually quite well placed, and I just simply played knight d5, which makes f3 impossible. And just black has a pretty good position here, and I won the game, which I will actually attach in the PGNs. So white is pretty advised to take this queen as it's so active. And after knight e4, one of my games here went bishop e3, which is a very reasonable move. Another possible move is bishop e1 that I'll come back to, but the position is around the same in both instances. So bishop to e3. And again, the position, like I said, is quite equal here. Black's main idea is to play c5, but there are other plans as well. So I played rook f to d8 this game, sort of preparing some central play. And now my opponent played the move c3. It's very possible for whites to play g4 here, just grabbing some space on the king side. And this variation is actually there's a pretty well-known solution for black here. c5, this pawn break in the center, aiming to just get rid of white's extra space. And one variation runs f3, cd, bishop d4. Now bishop c5, a nice intermediate move while the knight's hanging. And after bishop takes, knight takes, we actually have a very similar position to what was reached in my game. I should also mention that it's quite possible to play slowly with rook c8, sort of not really committing anything, just bringing the pieces to the game. That can be tried if you want to keep more pieces on the board. But a game that I played against a pretty decent, almost master player went c3. And again, I could have played the move rook c8, but I decided to simply break with c5, keeping it simple here. My opponent took bishop takes, knight takes. And again, this position seems pretty equalish. But to be honest, there are some imbalances in the position. Again, this pawn on h5, it's always a question, is it a strength, is it a weakness? And furthermore, both sides have a pawn majority, so white has a 3-2 on the queen side, which is an advantage for white, of course. But black also has these 4 pawns here against white's 3. And how the game continued was f3, f6, knight g6. So I give up this outpost here, but after king f7, king c2, e5, I start to sort of get my pawns rolling up the board. And I ended up winning this game in a pretty nice fashion. Again, I'm going to attach this game into accompanying PGNs. But all in all, this position is completely fine for black. And, okay, there are even some chances, of course, with pushing these pawns down the board, or maybe even swinging the knight around somewhere in case white gets too ambitious. And there's even the potential plan of pushing these pawns down the board in some positions and trying to create a weakness in white's camp. I also mentioned that there's this move bishop e1 here. Again, the positions are pretty similar. One game that I was very inspired by that I'm putting in the PGNs, and that I've also used the ideas from this game, simply played the move rook f d8, and after f3, knight f6, bishop to f2, I simply played a lot of improving moves here in my position. Rook c8, getting this rook into action. My opponent played the move g4, after which I played king f8, getting the king close to the center, and this is how this game proceeded as well. And the game that I'm alluding to is a game between two grandmasters where black won in very great fashion. After c4, black played a6, and then used a very nice plan of bishop d6, bishop b8, bishop a7, putting pressure on white's center. And basically in this variation, what black just did not play c5 too quickly to keep more pieces on the board, and ended up winning a nice game. So I will attach that game. As I've already mentioned, these endgames are pretty harmless for black. Of course, they may look a little bit boring, but still, if you know the right plans, it's pretty simple. It could be actually quite simple to generate some positive chances. And if you're satisfied with the draw, well, that can also be done without too much effort. So that was the move 95, queen e4 here, which is quite safe for black, as it turns out. The last thing I will mention about king b1 very briefly is the following variation. And after castles, we just looked at knight e4, but there's also worth knowing this rare idea of queen e2. And I say this because this is a variation that I found through this trap once. And by playing this move c5, which I do not recommend because white has a absolutely stunning idea that I won't really get into, but it's this move d5. It's a very shocking pawn sacrifice that was used back in 2003 by Grandmaster Joe Bava to score an amazing victory. And instead, all you have to remember here is get this queen off this d-file with the move queen to b6, and I will attach a game, of course, here where I use this idea very simply, but there's really not much to show here. Black's idea is just to push c5 and open up some files towards white's king. So with that being said, we can now finish our examination of king b1 and switch to the move knight e4, which is a very popular option and that I faced many times, and it's also very common. It's a very common option for players who are really just not really sure what to do with white here, so they know this typical idea to free up the g pawn. And as I mentioned in the introduction to this all the materials here, this move actually commonly leads to an endgame, and a very important endgame. After knight e4, queen e4, knight f6, queen e2. It is worth mentioning here, there's also this move queen d3, which I've actually only faced once, but it sets a pretty nice trap. And the trap here is, and I'm going to repeat this, do not play this move. Do not play the move queen to d5. It's our natural move. It's the move we want to play this queen e4 idea. But here it actually doesn't work, because after c4, queen e4, the queen has this square on b3 targeting b7, and now it turns out that black is not getting the queen exchange, and worst of all, after rook to e1, this queen over here is going to have to slide all the way back to h7. Now we've seen positions where this is quite possible and quite alright, but in this case it's not going to be alright at all, as our king is going to be stuck in the center, and just a nasty line to avoid for black. So instead, after the move queen d3, there's two options. Now the move that I played in this position, it's a very simple solution. I simply played knight to g4, and the idea here was to attack f2, of course. So my international master opponent played queen e2 here to defend f2, and now I played the move queen to d5, and now I'm targeting a2. And the whole idea here is if he was to play c4, then I would borrow an idea that we saw in the bishop e3 variation, where I would simply play queen f5, where my queen will be quite well placed and very hard to dislodge. And this knight on g4 would also be quite well placed here, as it stops, potentially stops knight e5 ideas. Simply this knight would be exchanged. Instead, my opponent played king b1, and I just castled long. So no short castling this variation. It's a safe way to play. I think black is already completely fine here. This pawn on the queen on d5 is very active. This pawn on h5 is loose. My opponent played the move knight e5, but after the simple knight takes, pawn takes, queen to g2, my opponent should have played rook g1, after which I plan to play queen h3, rook g7, queen f5, with a position that is objectively equal, but I quite like black's chances here. My queen on f5 is very strong. I'm targeting 3 of his pawns while also defending my own pawn formation. So quite a safe variation for black to play here. And another option that has recently gotten quite popular here is to play the quick c5. And here white generally gives check, after which play goes into this endgame here, where black again should be very close to equal, if not already equal, and a little bit similar to the endgames that we just looked at. But yeah, so this is the move queen d3, but I've only actually faced this move once, but it's quite important, so you do not play this move queen d5 here, as it falls into a nasty trap. So queen e2 is the move that I faced quite a bit of times, and now queen to d5. Again, this is our main idea. And the pawn on a2 is hanging, and almost 90% of my games, white has played c4, trying to dislodge this queen, after which we play queen e4. Now, if white plays king b1 here, now queen e4 is possible immediately. I guess you could castle, which would allow a transposition to this critical bishop e3 variation. And maybe it's also possible to consider the move b5 here to just stop c4. But in all my games, white has played this move c4, thinking it's like nice, aggressive, you get the queen out of the way. We're going to play queen e4 and follow with our plan, and now we're going to have a look at this endgame here. By the way, one of my games, my opponent played bishop e3, which tries to avoid the queen exchange, but the queen is actually very well placed on e4, and after our typical strike with b5, white's king is really going to be starting to pay the price. And this queen is quite active here. After, for example, knight to d2, the queen can just drop back to f5. Queen h7 is also possible, but maybe a little too fancy here. But after rook to h4, another idea here, the queen can indeed drop back to h7. If you go to f5, you may have to deal with some rook f4 ideas. So queen h7 here is actually perfectly natural. And the main idea to actually show here is after c takes b5, which looks like, of course, would be very bad for black if he takes, because the queen would come in. It's actually possible to play the amazing-looking rook c8, which just threatens to open up the c-file. And this is actually similar to the first game that we saw in this chapter, where this queen and rook combined to wreak absolute havoc on the light squares. So white really should exchange this queen here. And now bishop e3. So again, as I've mentioned in the introduction to the Capablanca variation, I've actually reached this endgame on many occasions. In fact, one of the games that I reached here, my opponent, who's rated 2300, he actually prepared this particular variation to try to get a quick draw with me. And I know this because he blitzed all his moves out here, and then he offered me a draw. So again, I don't think this endgame poses really any problems for black. If we just, for example, we can play normally with castles, and then rook to d8, and then potentially rook c8, and then you can try for b5 or c5. Those are all viable ideas. The position is very close to equal in all these variations, but the move that I've mostly favored here and have been very successful is this aggressive-looking move f5, which is double-edged, of course, because I'm weakening this dark square, I'm weakening this light square. but it's a very tactical move. The idea here is f4. Of course, if white isn't doing anything, let's say he's just minding his business with a move like king b1, after f4, he's going to be dropping in exchange. So it's a move that demands attention. Now, it's a move that I've always liked because it actually poses quite a nice positional trap. Perhaps one of the most obvious moves for white here is to play the move g3, which stops f4.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.